And now, everyone, please put your hands together and we'll give a warm welcome to your host, Aaron Cook.
Thanks. So today we're going to do a postmortem, and we're going to talk about probably the coolest IP I've gotten to work on, James Bond. And so I'm going to go over both of these games, Thunderball and Casino Royale. They were developed in tandem, in parallel, by two separate teams. One I had the privilege of leading, the other I had the privilege of helping. So let's get into it. So I want to first start off by acknowledging some unique circumstances that we had going through development. Every project has them, right? So no project is the same as the other one. We did have a compressed schedule. We were asked to do 18 months of development in 6 months, and we figured out a way to pull that off, but that is not the norm. We had a shared code base, so Thunderball and Casino Royale both shared the same fundamental code base and same architecture, and so any changes that happened in one game would also happen in the other, and so we had to find a way to reconcile that. And it was a new license for us, right? This is the first time that we had ever worked with Eon. It's the first time Eon had ever worked in our space. So there was a lot to go through and learn looking at these things. And then just as a disclaimer kind of throughout, you're going to see some imagery. After we wrapped on these games, we did an Artist Among Us series. So it was this gallery series, and all of the art that you see are from employees of Scientific Games. So part of the reasons that we succeeded. We stripped away everything except for the main feature that was shared between the two games when we inherited Thunderball. And there's a few reasons that we did this. We looked at really trying to understand and everything that was happening in the Casino Royale code base as we took this on was going to be time consuming. And they just have a different development pipeline than we do. So when we took the time to kind of assess that, we were just like, you know what, we could make this work, or we could just burn it to the ground and build it up the way that we want to build it up, so that we know what we're working with. We know, like, we're not trying to figure out somebody else's bugs, right? It's all our own mistakes and problems, and that made everything a lot smoother. We also used animatics throughout the entire development process, and so we would take the time to actually break down and put together a video of how we wanted the feature to ultimately look, which would take anywhere from a day to a week of an artist's time, but would save engineers hours, right? It would save them weeks of work that we just didn't have the ability to recuperate with the compressed schedule. We also were really good at communication. I think there's a lot of emphasis in Scrum with having daily stand-ups and having a weekly meeting and a retrospective meeting and all these like sprint reviews. We just focused on, you know what, that's great, Scrum's great. Let's just focus on having good communication. That's the whole point of this. That's what it's supposed to facilitate. And so just by doing that, just by really focusing on having really strong communication, we were able to get ahead of a lot of problems that we would otherwise have. And some of that came down to just managing communication, right? So making sure that this conversation has gotten like into the paragraphs level of detail in an email thread. Let's just have a conversation instead. And there was a lot of just taking initiative, right? So not waiting for somebody to give permission or to say, yes, that's approved, you can do whatever thing, just moving forward and just like recognizing we may have to revert the build, we may have to lose some work, but let's just move forward and let's just deliver on the content. And that's really part of where the execution came down with the engineering as well. One thing that I think was extremely beneficial is we had daily builds with art updated that they could review on target and have a very good idea of how things are looking and feeling so that the art team could iterate quickly as well. We also had a very targeted art direction that my senior art manager, Mike Feeney, worked really closely with our lead engineer on the project, Steve Kopanek, and just to kind of hone in the scope of everything. And so everything was laser focused to deliver a solid experience that felt full and felt complete within this narrow time frame. And a lot of that was working with the designer and understanding their vision and what they wanted to create. And again, that goes back to just that exceptional communication, right? But then there was also an aspect of, okay, let's make sure that the way we approach this from an artistic standpoint is simpler, and let's leverage some of the iconic imagery from Thunderball that was used in its marketing material when it first came out. Doing that helped just immensely with saving on time, really, because we were able to recycle a bunch of assets. We were able to paint up things rather than have to create something from scratch. So that helps a ton. We were able to validate before checking in anything, which was, it sounds simple. It sounds like something that you should just know to do, but not everybody did. And it was a key distinguishing factor between the two games and their development. For Thunderball, we made a point to, anytime anybody committed anything to the code base, to check and validate that everything's working the way it's supposed to. And it prevented a lot of PIDs and a lot of issues that would have otherwise slowed down development. We also used multiple scenes. So each engineer, each area of the game, we had an engineer assigned to it, and that area of the game was its own scene. And doing this multiple scene management, which if you're unfamiliar with Unity or Unreal, is just breaking it up into different areas where the engine is focusing and operating, allowed us to kind of divide and conquer and not have a bunch of people stepping on each other's toes working in the same area of the code. We also divided art and engineering into streams, and there were 2 different streams in Perforce. And so one thing that, and this was a very key distinguishing factor between the production of Casino Royale and the production of Thunderball. So for Casino Royale, they had artists in engine, which meant the artists could do more powerful, more cool, more impressive things, but it would take longer, and they would need more engineering support. And we kept everything very flat, simple animations, simple streaming textures, and just PNG sequences. And that helped our engineers take the content and import it and supply it to the engine, rather than having the artists do that themselves, who are less acquainted with best practices for, I mean, simple things just like making sure your images are divisible by 4, right? Just the aspect ratio. We also had a very tempered approach to leveraging new tech, right? The other team, they made a point to have artists in engine and like try to be on the bleeding edge, doing the coolest thing. I think they made the coolest looking game of the pair. And I think that helped them, but it also took a lot longer. They also inherited a lot of risk. They didn't do a good job managing that risk by limiting new tech and limiting new things. As sexy as that newness is, it comes with a lot of unknown, and in that unknown is usually the thing that's going to get you. We also made sure that like we were just enthused, right? The designer, I don't think we have a more enthusiastic, more, I don't know if precocious is the right word. He just has this like boyish charm to him. Like he just has this wonderful energy on any game that he works on where he's really excited and everything's the coolest thing ever and he's going to get you too. And it's hard, it's very infectious, and it's hard not to be excited about the content you're working on. A, because it's James Bond, and B, because Jeff is just so into it and it's the coolest thing you've ever worked on. And so having that level of just energy and enthusiasm really helps keep the team motivated. And I think, you know, it's one of the things that was a success for both teams, right? Like him having that level of energy on both teams really helped everybody succeed. Now, I could talk all day about everything we did right, but there's still a lot that we could do better, right? And so there are opportunities for improvement. So for the shared areas of the code base, we should have had a common class, Like that would have been a very simple thing to do up front that would have saved a lot of headache. We don't, in our current development pipeline, we don't run into this stuff as much where we have shared code bases, but it is a thing that still occurs from time to time, and now we've learned that this is a thing that we should do. We've learned that we should stop trying to build games on the backs of other games, right? Because we had this narrow window to get something done, and one team decided to build theirs on the back of a legacy product. We decided, you know what, this isn't successful. I have no idea how they engineered this. I don't know what problems I'm going to inherit. We should just burn things to the ground, start it up from scratch. And that's even become kind of our MO when we're prototyping now. We actually go through and we look at, okay, how can I get this built quickly so that it's represented well, so that you can play and experience, and the powers that be and designers and whoever else can go through and experience the intended design of the game without creating too much risk and committing too much into it. And then, okay, yeah, that's what you want? Cool. Now we burn that down and build it up the right way. We also, as simple as it is, everybody should have been on Slack. It took a week to do this and has significantly improved communication for my team. We now hold most of our stand-ups on Slack because it's more convenient, right? I've got core hours start core hours are 10 to 4, and I have people that come in early because they want to leave at 4, and people that come in at 10 because they want to sleep in. And so when you provide that level of flexibility to your team, you're going to have team members who are already in the zone, primed, ready to go. They're just in that cognitive flow state, working. Oh, hey, can you take 10 minutes away from whatever you're doing that's really important that you're already in the zone on, and can you come over here and have a conversation with us about the thing that you're already doing? Just totally breaks down their mental flow. And so getting everyone into Slack to where it's just an automated thing that pops up where you can just quickly type, hey, here's what I'm working on, when it's convenient for you to take that mental break to do that, has helped immensely. We have an in-house tool that needs very substantial overhaul. It took a year for us to do that and to explore that, and it's taken a lot of effort from multiple teams, from multiple engineers, but it has been worth it. We are so much faster now as a result of it. One thing that we ran into working with test as well was steps to reproduce were not always clear, they weren't always concise, they weren't always complete, and sometimes weren't even present. And when somebody tells you this is broken and you have no way to chase that down and figure out how it's broken, it slows down everything, because now you have to go have a conversation with the quality assurance engineer who wrote the PID, and you have to figure out, PID, by the way, for anybody who doesn't know, is problem ID. You have to have that conversation. They have to remember what the thing was and how it occurred. They then have to collaborate on replicating it in person so that they can see it, or they could have just done the right thing in the first place, documented everything clearly, taken a video of it. We've got ways to do this where it's very clear what happened, so the engineer can then go into the code and try to fix it. Our workflows in Jira still need revision. It's complicated because we have 200 projects across Jira that all use these workflows. And so it's been something that I've been working on to try and remap, but it's taking a lot of time and it takes a lot of buy-in because it's going to affect every project in development that has been developed and will be developed. So it's a very considered thing to try and pursue. We also, between the two teams, because we had a shared area of the code base, we tried to put in place a working agreement. The producer that attempted to facilitate that did not invite the producer for the other team, which is ineffective, didn't invite many of the engineers for the other team when discussing this, so he just kind of came up with this list of rules and imposed it on them. And that's not really a productive way to facilitate any kind of business, right? the way that should have been approached and communicated should have been collaborative, and rather than dictating. And I think working agreements can be beneficial for projects, but once you've worked with a team long enough, there's just kind of social norms that, like, unless it needs to be written down, there's no need to waste time doing that. QA had a lot of difficulty getting the status of math. So for our games, we have mathematicians that go through and create the full systems kind of experience. So they're very akin to like a systems designer, and it's one of the things that we need to have a very involved assessment of, so that we can release to the proper jurisdictions. And our mathematician doing the math for both games was understandably overwhelmed. It wasn't the only game on his plate, and it's very difficult. It's been very difficult for us to understand the nuances of what they need to do and how long it's going to take take them to do the thing that they need to do to achieve like a deliverable product. We're actually going through right now and taking a look at how we like produce our schedules for games, how we predict when we're going to land, and considering the mathematicians a lot more as a result of this, because we've realized that they are the most fundamental part to the entire equation of making a game for us. So that's the thing that we are now looking at designing everything around when we're architecting a plan to deliver a game. And then lastly, when design changes happen, and they will, right? No game goes through exactly as it was initially thought up. It doesn't get launched like perfect. No perfect game exists. And so there's going to be changes throughout, and when that happens, there needs to be flow diagrams that are updated so that QA can then reassess and reevaluate their test cases. Because we were flying so fast, we weren't providing these things to them, and it made them very hard. It made it very hard for them to do their job. So why does this even matter, right? Like, they both went out, they both made money. Why does it even matter? So just looking at, without giving numbers, just looking at the cost of development in terms of days and time spent, Casino Royale spent 321 days in development, and we spent only 238. And it changed studios as well. So from the time it changed studios and came into our shop in our house, was about 7 months of total development. The other team was approaching like 11 or 12. So, spending a lot more time in development means the game cost a lot more to develop, right? And what that looks like is this. So this may be hard to read, so there's actual numbers to kind of help clarify. But the peak performance of Casino Royale, and I honestly think this isn't anything to do with the games themselves. I think it's just that Thunderball was the first, right? And so because it was the first out the door, it had a better peak performance week. It had a better week overall, just for like its best week in terms of how much coin in it earned. And we deployed enough units that we were actually able to help support and further Casino Royale. So that's where all this stuff comes into play. And lastly, do you guys have any questions? There's people coming around with mics, is my understanding. I may have gone through that faster than you expected.
So when you say that you switched studios at first,
Yeah.
for the development, how was that like? What stage of development was the project like when you got it?
So they had developed, so like the art wasn't there, but the engineering was, if that makes sense. So there was a lot of, there was like some placeholder art, and there was enough to represent what should eventually happen, but there wasn't anything that was at all indicative of like final design. And so for the art team, it was a lot of like working from scratch. There was there, fortunately, because of that shared area, the code base and that shared feature, like that art was shared across both games and saved us a lot of iteration time on that because we were able to borrow from what they had already done. We also had the design very well defined from what they had already done, and that helped accelerate things as well.
Let's get one from this side of the room.
Sure.
There's plenty of time, guys. To go.
What were the hours like when you were working on this?
So I had a few engineers. I never asked anyone to crunch. Let me just say that. I had a few engineers that elected to put in extra hours themselves. I made a point that if anybody was going to work extra hours or take extra time or anything like that, I got approval and budget set aside so that if that was going to happen, if that's something they were going to do, to let me know, and I would buy them dinner. Right? Like that's the least I can do if you're going to stay late and work late. So I had two engineers, one that was supporting the other team, and then the one that was working specifically on the shared area of the code base. Because of the difference in engineering practices and policies, it just required more of their time because having art embedded in the development process versus having art support the development process, it's just two entirely different engineering mindsets. And it took a lot more work from them to be able to facilitate that. Yeah.
So you said you had two teams basically working on two different video games but working together?
Yeah.
How did you, through the development process, prioritize with your small schedule, prioritize what needs to go here, when are we going to start coding down on this, and when are we going to start art on this, and who's writing which, and what team's going to do what on what day?
So I never get into the granularity when I'm managing a project of this needs to be done on this specific day. It's more of here's all the work that needs to happen. Here's all the things that need to be present, right? And this is the priority that I need them to occur in. So a lot of that came from the designer of what do you need to see next so that you can keep iterating through the design and working towards a final product. Portions of it came from the licensor, right? Because it's a licensed product and we're working with Eon and they need to look at things and review things. So it's, okay, what do you need to see next? What do you need to approve next? And so it was just iterating through that and grooming the backlog based on those priorities. There were another thing that kind of came up through this was, and this is a practice that I now kind of hold to this day, we were asked to make a show build. So if you're in the AAA world, that's kind of like a demo for E3 or something like that. And rather than divert resources, make a specific show build, it was you'll get the latest build that's stable. That's it. And so we didn't waste any time diverting our attention on making something for one of our various shows that was occurring during development. It was just, here's what's stable. Honestly, customers just need to see it. They don't need to necessarily experience it. So that's kind of how we managed some of that, was looking at what's the next most important thing that needs to be there, and then working our way down the list.
You mentioned working with a shared code base. Did you feel it was more helpful or more harmful to be working in that kind of environment?
I think it would have been, I think for the health of the teams and the studios, I think it was more harmful. I think in terms of learning new engineering practices, it was helpful. But this was not the project to learn on, right? This was the project to execute. And so in that regard, I think it was just a bad decision. But it did save time in terms of not having to iterate through the same thing twice, right? It's been created, you don't need to recreate it again. So that in some regards it helped, in some regards it was very damaging.
Kind of looked you up before we showed up to the seminar.
Yeah.
You've worked on a couple other games such as Lord of the Rings, correct?
Yeah.
How is it working? Do you ever this situation? You ever been between two projects and like the engines were completely different, so you have to switch your mind to like working on this set, otherwise to this one?
Yeah, so we have right now we have like one GDK that we operate on. We use Unity, and it's kind of like our own version of Unity because we have to build our own OS because we're super regulated. But there's so like in terms of the different engines, that simplifies things. There are different designs that I have to keep up with and kind of keep straight in my head. Like for instance, well, no, one ship. So I've got like 14 or 15 games in flight right now, actively being developed. And so a lot of it is making sure that I have an understanding of the business purpose, right? Like, why are we making this game? What is the point? And so once I have an understanding of that, it's then an understanding of, okay, how are we delivering to fulfill that business purpose? Like, what are we how are we going to achieve that? And from there, just wrapping my head around the actual design and sometimes helping inform the designer and be like, that's not the point of this game. We're not doing that with this. We're trying to do this. But most of the time, they have a pretty good grasp of that themselves. Yeah, it's super rare. Any other questions?
For game development, and you had such a short time or shorter time than the other people who were making the other one, how was it working on a crunch time with the writers and everyone doing narrative and also trying to get everything on the development side of the technicality, like
Sure.
working together and fast?
So we don't have any storytelling in our game, so that eliminates all that. As far as working with the artists, I think that there was a very deliberate point being made that like we're going to update the build at this time, right? So like have your assets in Perforce by end of day so that we can push the new art to the cabinet. So there was a lot of effort put into making sure that people were able to review their content quickly within context. But that was the focus, right? Like, let's just iterate fast. And so it was kind of weird because we didn't necessarily do sprints, and if we did, they were almost daily sprints rather than like 2-week sprints. Yeah.
Hi. So you mentioned already the show build that you had made and working with an IP as large as 007. Was there any extra strain that was put on the team for trying to make certain requirements that was listed?
So was there any strain on the team trying to accommodate licensor requests? Is that your ask? Yeah. So that is a real thing. Eon's great if they're watching, but all licensors are difficult. There's aspects just because like they have one goal, you have another goal, right? Their goal is to protect the integrity of the brand and the IP they've built and developed and poured for Bond billions of dollars into, right? Our goal is to exploit their success for our own success, right? And so that's something that you kind of have to keep in mind when you're working with licensors. And there's been times where there's been an ask and it's like, oh, you can't do that for these reasons, or I know I said you could do this before, but I got in trouble for saying that, and so now you have to do it this way instead. And so there's all these. It's just a relationship that you continue to grow and develop. If you have a keen understanding of your pipeline, you can work with the licensor and kind of meet them halfway and say like, hey, we can do that, but that's going to take 3 months, and we're trying to get this out in July. Or, well, so it sounds like this is your concern, right? Okay, well, if we approach it this way, we can make it look like this. And so it's not exactly what you're asking for, but it won't take the same amount of time as what you're asking for, and we can kind of meet you in the middle. And so I think most licensors that I work with are very reasonable. And once you present things in that kind of time frame context, they're willing to work with you. No, you guys are great. Thanks for coming out.
All right, everyone, we do have another session in this room after this, so if you don't mind, just collect all of your belongings. Don't forget cell phones, backpacks, trash, things like that. Aaron's still here, you guys, so I'm sure he'll be hanging out outside, out there, if you guys want to chat. Awesome.